But first tonight, to the bombshell news that Iran is behind two major anti-Semitic attacks in Australia, the firebombings of a Melbourne synagogue and a Sydney Jewish deli. The attacks on the Adass Israel Synagogue and the Lewis Continental Kitchen shook the Australian Jewish community, sparking fear and anxiety. Yet some sections of the media, police and even politicians gaslit Australians, absurdly claiming the anti-Semitism crisis was a hoax and that there was no evidence hatred of Jews was the motivation for these attacks. That was utterly wrong. Australia's intelligence agencies told the federal government just yesterday that Iran was ultimately behind these violent terror attacks. In the face of these chilling developments, the Albanese government had no option but to act today, listing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organisation, despite refusing to do so for more than 2 years.
ASIO has now gathered enough credible intelligence to reach a deeply disturbing conclusion that the Iranian government directed at least 2 of these attacks. Iran has sought to disguise its involvement, but ASIO assesses it was behind the attacks on the Lewis Continental Kitchen in Sydney on October 20 last year and the Adass Israel Synagogue in Melbourne on December 6 last year.
The Albanese government has now expelled the Iranian ambassador and 3 other officials as well, also suspended the Australian embassy in Tehran. This is the first time in the post-war period that Australia has expelled an ambassador. ASIO Director General Mike Burgess, who has done an absolutely brilliant job, he said his organisation is still investigating whether Iran is also behind other anti-Semitic attacks.
We have investigated dozens of incidents targeting Jewish communities, places of worship, businesses and prominent individuals. ASIO now assesses the Iranian government directed at least 2 and likely more attacks on Jewish interests in Australia. It goes without saying, Iran's actions are utterly unacceptable. They put lives at risk, they terrified the community and they tore at our social fabric.
Now, Burgess made 2 important points today. Firstly, that Iran did not conduct every attack, and also that this does not mean there's no anti-Semitism in Australia.
But I want to stress we do not believe the regime is responsible for every act of anti-Semitism in Australia.
And he had to make that point because you can already imagine how the left media would try to incorrectly interpret these developments. And we saw a Channel 9 journalist today bizarrely try to suggest that Netanyahu should apologise to Albanese. I mean, honestly, it's utterly ludicrous. Now, Burgess has strongly warned that anti-Semitism is the #1 threat to life in our country. Iran is one part of the problem, not the full extent of it. And today, Burgess explained how Iran had tried to hide its involvement with a complex web of proxies.
Our painstaking investigation uncovered and unpicked the links between the alleged crimes and the commanders in Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. The IRGC used a complex web of proxies to hide its involvement. This is the sort of obfuscation and boundary blurring I warned about earlier this year.
And we get more detail on this from Jeff Chambers in The Australian tonight. He reports that unravelling this complex web involved encrypted communications, cryptocurrency and financial transactions crisscrossing the globe. He writes this involved cracking anonymising technology, including dedicated encrypted communication devices, which was used to coordinate the Iranian-backed attacks. He also says that investigators focused on young criminals based in Australia who were actively recruited, radicalised online and encouraged to commit anti-Semitic attacks. The forensic investigation, which was supported by Five Eyes security partners, including US intelligence agencies, was built around the need to gather hard evidence. Now, you have to say, as you sit here tonight, thank goodness there are still grown-ups like Mike Burgess steering our national security and trying to keep us safe. And with this dire warning from Burgess, the Albanese government was forced to take action. The Prime Minister said today that Iran's aggression would not be tolerated.
These were extraordinary and dangerous acts of aggression orchestrated by a foreign nation on Australian soil. They were attempts to undermine social cohesion and sow discord in our community. It is totally unacceptable, and the Australian government is taking strong and decisive action in response. A short time ago, we informed the Iranian ambassador to Australia that he would be expelled. We have suspended operations at our embassy in Tehran, and all our diplomats are now safe in a third country.
So the government will now list the IRGC as a terrorist organisation. But it's something it should have done a long time ago. The undeniable truth is that the Albanese government was very slow to act on the grave threat Iran poses. It has faced repeated calls from the coalition and the Jewish community to list the IRGC as a terrorist organisation, also to expel the ambassador. But it's refused to do so. And this is also despite a recommendation from a Senate committee back in early 2023, and other countries like Canada and the US have also listed the IRGC. Andrew Wallace made this point when he was speaking with Kieran Gilbert a bit earlier.
Senior coalition members have been calling for the IRGC to be listed as a terrorist organisation for more than 2 years, and the government has repeatedly said, not going to happen, it can't happen under the Crimes Act. We have said repeatedly, well, if the legislation needs changing, then we will support that. And the government has never brought that legislation through, but now they've listed the IRGC under the legislation that they say couldn't or didn't enable them to do it. So, you know, there are questions that need to be asked here of the Prime Minister, Penny Wong, and the Home Affairs Minister.
And I heard Julian Leeser speak about this with Steve Price earlier, and he was truly angry about it. And you very rarely see Julian Leeser angry. Now, Phil Curry from the Fin Review asked the Prime Minister about this today, and Albanese, of course, just brushed it off.
Your government has faced calls in the past from the opposition and others to list the IRGC as a terrorist outfit and to expel the ambassador, and you've resisted it on the grounds that it's important to have diplomatic relations with Iran, if only for the intelligence benefits through the Five Eyes and so forth. Is it now the case that what's happened here has outweighed that imperative? And is it also the case that there will be no more diplomatic relations as long as the IRGC remains in power in Iran?
Now, it's the case that having received this information yesterday, we went through our formal channels and made decisions.
No accountability at all. Now, about a year ago, I had the former head of the British Secret Intelligence Service on the show, Sir Richard Dearlove, and he warned about precisely this: Iranian influence operations here in Australia. Now, it's extraordinary that the former chief of MI6 knew that this would likely be taking place, and less than a year later, his warnings have turned out to be correct. Here was Sir Richard Dearlove on this show in September last year.
There's no question that Iran, will be exploiting these opportunities. I mean, they have a very active intelligence organisation which has a long history, in my view, of supporting terrorist movements. So, yes, there is a danger in this sort of infiltration of the Palestinian diaspora.
So, Richard, I'm intrigued by the comment you just made when you said Iran has a very sophisticated intelligence and they would be looking to infiltrate. They'd be looking for opportunities like this. What do you mean? How would that work?
Well, the IRGC, which is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, is, part of it's the primary intelligence organisation in Iran. I think there's no question that Australia, it may seem very distant from the Middle East, is to an extent inevitably involved in this situation. So, you know, we've seen. I mean, I remember when I was chief, this is way back, warning, when Alexander Downer was foreign minister, saying to Alexander, look, you know, you're not going to avoid this terrorist problem.
Now, Sir Richard Dearlove was absolutely correct. He could see this problem coming months before it unfolded, and he warned the Albanese government publicly on this program, and they took no notice. Iran is a grave threat, not just to Israel, but to all of us in the West, including here in Australia. And if you still doubt this, look at the extent of the destruction that Iran caused at the Adass Synagogue in Melbourne. So, Yumi, let's go through to where the fire really ripped through the synagogue.
Oh, look at this. This is unbelievable.
Oh, it's heartbreaking.
Horrific.
You were over here in the quiet early hours of the morning, absolute silence. Tell us what happened.
So I was sitting there, as you can see, my books there, the first table there. On the left-hand side, there, on the right-hand side of the table, there's some books still there, not completely burnt. And I was studying. Suddenly I hear this big bang. It felt like a sledgehammer on a wooden door.
And it was on this door here?
I think so. I don't know. But then a second later, another bang, and I saw glass flying out. So I knew that I was under attack. So I just jumped up, ran out, and I forgot my phone. When I went
Must have been terrifying, that moment.
I was terrified, yes, I was. But I am part of Hatsula, and I've got a radio on me, a walkie-talkie, and I got on there and I said, I'm under attack, can I have backup?
Now, it's only lucky lives weren't lost that day. And I'll never forget it. I felt devastated walking through the synagogue right after it was firebombed. Burnt to smithereens, as you just saw, hundreds of prayer books on the ground, the smell of smoke still thick in the air. I mean, it was so sad. It was heartbreaking. Yes. What usually happens in this room?
In this room, people study, and at about 6:30, that's when we start praying. So all this is full of books all around. The front is full of books. All over there is full of books. That's all gone with the fire.
You can just see here the burnt prayer books. It's truly, you wouldn't expect to see this in Australia in 2024.
Definitely not.
You're a proud Jew. You're living in Australia, a peaceful country. To think that you in your house of worship
such a thing could happen. I wouldn't believe that such a thing could happen here in Australia.
Now, this is exactly the type of violence and terrorism that Israel has been waging a war against. Yet there's been this horrible moral confusion in Australia where the Albanese government has allowed Israel to be seen as the enemy. And looking back at that Adass Synagogue damage, knowing that Iran is responsible for this hatred in Australia, thousands of miles away from Israel, it really should shoot home to the Albanese government who exactly the aggressor is. Now, as Netanyahu said to me on Thursday night, Israel is fighting a war on behalf of all of Western civilization.
Actually, we're fighting the war of Western civilization against these barbarians.
And to his credit, Albanese today finally acknowledged this was not just an attack on the Jewish community, but on Australia. And he's right in saying that. So Albanese now acknowledges the grave threat Iran poses, yet he claimed the Harbour Bridge rally was peaceful, the rally where Bob Carr, Ed Husick and Julian Assange and others stood in front of the poster of Iran Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. Now, they said they didn't know the poster was there or they didn't know who he was. But what is the Albanese government going to do about all these protesters who carry images of the Ayatollah? The Rule of Law Institute of Australia Vice President Chris Merritt told me today that the street protests here and elsewhere now look very much like one part of an orchestrated campaign coming out of Tehran. He says there is now a good argument that the weekend marches need to be shut down on national security grounds. They clearly help Iran's goals. Now, Iran is not only funding Hamas, Hezbollah and the Houthis, but it's also behind anti-Western movements and protests in cities like Sydney and Melbourne. And the Albanese government needs to recognise the dark forces behind these divisive rallies and finally show some courage, take some action to shut them down.